Hey guys, tonight we're talking about medieval tools. Not the kind that worked well. Not the kind that made life easier. But the kind that technically did something. Just not in a way anyone would describe as satisfying. These were tools invented with confidence. Used with hesitation. And tolerated with quiet resentment. They solved problems. But only just enough to prevent people from throwing them away entirely. So before you get comfortable, take a moment, like the video, and subscribe. But only if you genuinely enjoy what I do here. And let me know in the comments where you're tuning in from and what time it is for you. It's always interesting to see who else is awake. Questioning history. Instead of sleeping like a sensible person. Now. Let's begin. The medieval spoon. The medieval spoon was not designed to enhance the eating experience. It was designed to move food. From a bowl. To your mouth. With minimal philosophical resistance. And in that very narrow sense. It succeeded. But everything beyond that was deeply questionable. Early spoons were made from whatever material was available. Wood, bone, horn, occasionally metal. If you were wealthy enough to own something that could survive both use and theft. The shapes were inconsistent. Some were too shallow to hold anything meaningful. Others were so deep they required a level of commitment normally associated with long-term decisions. The handle, if it could be called that, was often short, uneven, and slightly suspicious. Holding it felt less like using a tool. And more like negotiating with an object that had its own opinions. And yet. People used them. Because the alternative was worse. Eating without a spoon in medieval times meant using your hands. Which sounds simple. Until you remember that most medieval meals were not dry. They were stews, broths, porridges. Meals that existed somewhere between solid and regret. Trying to eat that with your hands was not a dining experience. It was an event. Food slipped. Dripped. Escaped. It resisted you. The spoon, despite its flaws, offered control. Not good control. Not reliable control. But enough control to maintain a sense of dignity. And dignity, in medieval life, was a fragile thing. Now here's where the spoon truly failed. It was not personal. In many households, spoons were shared. One spoon. Multiple people. Taking turns. Pretending this was normal. Cleanliness was optimistic. You wiped it, maybe. On cloth. Or clothing. Or nothing at all. And then you passed it on. Which meant the spoon was not just a tool. It was a social contract. A quiet agreement. That everyone involved would simply not think too hard about what was happening. And yet. No one abandoned it. Because despite everything. The spoon worked just enough. So humanity kept it. We refined it. Standardized it. Gave it proper shape, proper balance. Proper hygiene. We made it comfortable. Predictable. Safe. And now. We don't even think about it. But the core idea hasn't changed. You still take a small curved object. Dip it into something questionable. And trust that it will deliver food. Without incident. And most of the time. It does. But every now and then. It spills. Just a little. Just enough. To remind you. That this is not a perfect system. This is a medieval idea. That survived. The medieval knife. The medieval knife was not a precision instrument. It was not specialized. It was not designed for elegance, efficiency, or safety. It was a blade. And that was considered enough. In fact, most people carried their own knife at all times. Not because they were prepared, but because there was no guarantee anyone else would be. This knife was used for everything. Eating. Cutting food. Cutting rope. Opening things that did not want to be opened. And occasionally, making situations worse. There was no distinction between a kitchen knife, a dining knife, and a tool. It was one object, doing too many jobs, with varying levels of success. Eating with a knife was particularly memorable. You didn't just cut your food. You navigated it carefully, because the blade was often dull in places, sharp in others, and entirely unpredictable throughout. Some cuts worked. Others required effort. Occasionally, the knife simply refused. And you had to rethink your entire approach to eating. Which is not something you want to do. Mid-meal. There were no forks. Not in the way we understand them. So after cutting your food, you either picked it up with your fingers, or used bread as a tool. Bread was not just food. It was equipment. A backup plan. A structural solution. And yet, despite all this, the knife remained essential. Because it solved just enough problems to justify its existence. But it failed in ways that were impossible to ignore. It was dangerous. Not dramatically dangerous, but consistently inconvenient. Small cuts were common. Slips happened. Accidents were part of the experience. Using a knife required attention, patience, and a willingness to accept minor consequences. And still, people kept using it. Because there was no better alternative. So humanity improved it. Slowly. We created different types. Different sizes. Different purposes. We separated tools by function. We introduced safety. Comfort. Control. But even now, the knife hasn't changed as much as we pretend it has. It still cuts. It still slips. It still demands attention. And if you're not careful, it still reminds you exactly what it was originally designed to do. The medieval fork was not welcomed into society. It arrived, quietly, with two thin prongs, and the confidence of an object that believed it belonged. It did not. Early forks were rare. Strange. Suspicious. People looked at them. And immediately felt uncomfortable. Because the fork did something unusual. It separated you from your food. And in medieval culture, that felt unnecessary. Food was meant to be touched, handled, understood directly. Introducing a small metal object between you and your meal was seen as excessive. Possibly arrogant. Definitely foreign. Some even believed it was unnatural. There were whispers that using a fork was a sign of vanity. That it suggested you were trying too hard to avoid the realities of eating. Which, in a way, was true. The fork did not improve food. It improved distance. And distance felt suspicious. Now, functionally, the fork barely worked. 2 prongs. That was it. Not enough to hold most things properly. Not enough to stab securely. Not enough to justify itself. Food slipped. Constantly. You would try to pick something up. And it would simply decline. Gently falling back onto the plate. As if rejecting the entire concept. Using a fork required patience, precision, and a quiet acceptance. That success was not guaranteed. So naturally, people rejected it. They mocked it. They ignored it. And for a while, It seemed like the fork would disappear. But it didn't. Because despite everything, it solved one very specific problem. It kept your hands clean. Not completely clean. Not reliably clean. But cleaner than before. And that small improvement was enough. So people tolerated it. Reluctantly. Then gradually. They adapted. The fork gained more prongs. Better balance. More purpose. It stopped being a curiosity. And became a tool. And now. We use it without thinking. But every now and then. Something slips. A piece of food refuses to cooperate. Slides away. Falls back. And in that moment. The fork remembers. What it used to be. The medieval plate. The medieval plate was not a plate. Not really. It was. Bread. Thick. Stale. Slightly resistant to life. This bread was called a trencher. Though no one needed a special name to understand what it was doing. It existed. To hold food. And absorb it. Slowly. Relentlessly. Meals were served on these trenchers. Not because it was elegant. But because it was practical. You could place meat. Vegetables. Sauces. Directly on top. And the bread would handle it. At first. But over time. The trenchers changed. They soaked up grease. Liquids. Flavors that were never meant to meet. They became heavy. Soft. Unpredictable. Eating from a trencher was not stable. Food shifted. Edges collapsed. Sometimes. The plate itself began to participate in the meal. Which was not always a good thing. And yet. People used them. Because the alternative was worse. Without trenchers. You needed bowls. And bowls required materials. Time. Effort. Bread was already there. So bread became infrastructure. Now here's where the failure becomes obvious. The plate. Did not last. By the end of the meal. It was no longer a plate. It was something else. Something saturated. Something tired. Something that had absorbed more than it should. Sometimes it was eaten. Sometimes it was given away. Sometimes it was quietly discarded. But it was never reused. Because it couldn't be. Which meant every meal required new plates. Fresh ones. Temporary ones. Disposable. Before disposal was even a concept. And yet. The idea survived. We replaced bread with wood. Wood with ceramic. Ceramic with glass. We made plates stronger. Cleaner. Permanent. But the core idea remained untouched. A flat surface. Holding food. Temporarily. And even now. Plates break. They chip. They crack. They fail at the exact moment you need them not to. And when they do. You're left holding pieces. Of something that was never meant to last forever. Just like the trencher. The medieval cup. The medieval cup was not designed for comfort. It was designed to hold liquid. And release it. In a direction that was hopefully useful. Cups were made from wood. Metal. Ceramic. Sometimes leather. Which raises questions no one answered. They were uneven. Rough around the edges. Occasionally too heavy. Occasionally too light. And rarely balanced. Holding one required attention. Because the cup did not assist you. It simply existed. And you had to work around it. Drinking was not automatic. You had to position it carefully. Tilt it slowly. Trust that the liquid would behave. It often didn't. Spills were common. Edges dripped. Rims leaked. Handles, if they existed, were decorative at best. And yet, cups were shared. Not always. But often enough to make it uncomfortable. One cup. Passed between people. With the quiet understanding that no one would acknowledge it. Cleanliness was optional. Wiping it on a sleeve was considered effort. Now here's where the cup truly failed. It changed the taste. Wood absorbed flavors. Metal added its own. Leather contributed something else entirely. What you drank was not always what you tasted. Water tasted like yesterday. Wine tasted like everything. And yet, people kept drinking. Because the cup still worked. Barely. It delivered liquid. Most of the time. And that was enough. So humanity improved it. We smoothed the edges. Standardized the shapes. Added proper handles. Refined materials. We made cups reliable. But even now, they spill. They stain. They break. They hold on to flavors longer than they should. And every now and then, you take a sip. And something tastes slightly off. Not wrong. Just not quite right. And for a brief moment, you understand the medieval experience. The medieval bucket. The medieval bucket was not built for efficiency. It was built to carry things. With determination. And very little cooperation. Water was the main concern. Getting it. Moving it. Keeping it contained. The bucket existed to solve that problem. And it did. Technically. Buckets were made from wood. Held together with metal bands. Shaped into something that resembled reliability. But only from a distance. Up close. They leaked. Not dramatically. Not immediately. But slowly. Persistently. Water found its way through the gaps. Between the wood. Around the edges. It escaped. Quietly. As if it had somewhere better to be. Carrying a bucket was not just about transport. It was about timing. You had to move quickly enough. To arrive before the contents diminished. Too slow. And the bucket betrayed you. Too fast. And you spilled it yourself. Either way. Loss was expected. Handles were another issue. Rope. Wood. Metal. All slightly uncomfortable. All unreliable over time. They dug into your hand. Slipped under pressure. Occasionally broke at the worst possible moment. Which meant the bucket did not just fail quietly. Sometimes. It failed all at once. Water gone. Effort wasted. You standing there. Reconsidering everything. And yet. People used them. Constantly. Because there was no alternative. Water had to move. And the bucket. Moved it. Imperfectly. But enough. So we kept it. We improved materials. Sealed the gaps. Strengthened the handles. We made buckets that don't leak. That don't fail unexpectedly. But even now. They tip. They spill. They crack. And every time you carry one. You are trusting. That this time. It will behave. Just like they did. The medieval hammer was not precise. It was not balanced. It was not engineered for comfort. It was heavy. Attached to a handle. and expected to solve problems through impact. And in fairness, it did. Just not gently. Early hammers were inconsistent. The head was often uneven. Slightly off-center. With weight distributed in ways that suggested no one had tested it twice. Swinging it required confidence. Not skill. Not technique. Confidence. Because once it started moving, it committed. There was no subtle correction. No graceful adjustment. You aimed. And hoped the hammer agreed. Sometimes it did. Other times, it introduced your hand to consequences. Handles were rough. Splintered. Slightly too thick, or too thin. Grip was not a design feature. It was a personal responsibility. If your hand slipped, that was not the hammer's fault. That was yours. For trusting it. Now here's where the hammer failed in a quiet way. It didn't just hit the target. It affected everything around it. Wood cracked where it shouldn't. Nails bent unpredictably. Surfaces absorbed more force than necessary. The hammer solved one problem. By creating smaller ones nearby. And yet, it remained essential. Because there was no alternative. If something needed force, this was the answer. So people adapted. They learned how to hold it. How to swing it. How to work around its personality. And over time, we improved it. We balanced the head. Refined the handle. Added grip. We made it safer. More controlled. But even now, it still misses. Still slips. Still occasionally reminds you that it was never meant to be gentle. The medieval plow. The medieval plow was not efficient. It was not smooth. It was not kind to the earth. Or the person using it. It was a heavy wooden structure. Dragged through soil. With effort that bordered on negotiation. Plows were pulled by animals. Usually oxen, sometimes horses. Depending on what was available. And how optimistic you were feeling. The soil did not cooperate. It resisted. Thick, uneven, unpredictable. The plow cut through it slowly. Sometimes effectively. Sometimes not at all. You pushed. The animals pulled. And together, you created something resembling progress. But it wasn't clean. Lines were uneven. Depth varied. Some areas were turned properly. Others were barely touched. Which meant farming was not precise. It was hopeful. Now here's where the plow truly failed. It demanded everything. Time. Energy. Patience. And still, it did not guarantee results. You could spend an entire day working the field. And still end up with soil that was inconsistent. Which affected planting. Which affected growth. Which affected survival. And yet, people used it. Because without it, there was nothing. No crops. No food. No future. The plow was flawed. But necessary. So humanity improved it. We added metal blades. Better structure. Better control. We made it stronger. More reliable. But even now, farming is still uncertain. Machines replaced animals. But the earth still resists. Weather still interferes. And effort does not always guarantee outcome. The plow changed shape. But not its nature. The medieval scissors. The medieval scissors were not smooth. They did not glide. They did not assist. They resisted. Early scissors were simple. Two blades. Connected by a spring-like strip of metal. You squeezed. And they cut. You released. And they opened again. That was the entire system. And it worked. Just not comfortably. The tension was inconsistent. Sometimes too tight. Forcing you to apply more pressure than expected. Sometimes too loose. Causing uneven cuts. Edges that looked like hesitation. Cutting cloth was particularly frustrating. The blades didn't always align perfectly. Which meant instead of slicing, they chewed. Slowly. Deliberately. As if the fabric had offended them. Your hand tired quickly. The repeated motion. Squeeze, release, squeeze, release. Became less about cutting. And more about endurance. Now here's where scissors failed in a subtle way. They required cooperation. From the material. From your hand. From the blades themselves. And if any part of that system failed, the entire process slowed down. Which it often did. And yet, people used them. Because cutting things cleanly mattered. Even if cleanly was an optimistic description. So we improved them. Added pivot points. Balanced blades. Refined grip. We made scissors that move easily. Cut smoothly. Respond instantly. But even now, they jam. They dull. They struggle with certain materials. And sometimes, they still chew. Instead of cut. A quiet reminder. Of where they started. The medieval lock, tool perspective. The medieval lock was not secure. Not really. It existed. To create the feeling of security. Which is a different thing entirely. Locks were large. Awkward. Made of metal that looked strong. But behaved unpredictably. Keys were equally dramatic. Long. Complex. And slightly theatrical. Using one felt less like unlocking something. And more like performing a ritual. You inserted the key. Turned it carefully. And hoped the mechanism agreed. Sometimes it did. Sometimes it resisted. Sometimes it simply refused. Locks jammed. They stuck. They required force. Patience. And occasionally, improvisation. Now here's where the failure becomes clear. They didn't stop determined people. They slowed them down. Slightly. A lock did not say, "This cannot be opened." It said, "This might take a moment." And that moment was often enough. Not to prevent theft. But to encourage thieves. To choose something easier. And yet, people trusted them. Because the idea of protection was comforting. Even if the reality was fragile. So humanity improved locks. Added complexity. Better mechanisms. More precision. But even now, locks fail. Keys get lost. Doors jam. Systems break. And we still check them twice. Not because they are perfect. But because we want them to be. The medieval ladder. The medieval ladder was not stable. It was not reassuring. It was not something you used without thinking. It was two long pieces of wood, connected by smaller pieces of wood, with the expectation that you would trust it completely. And people did. Because they had to. Ladders allowed access. Roofs. Storage. Places that were otherwise unreachable. But climbing one was an act of quiet courage. The wood creaked. Shifted slightly. Each step felt tentative. Not unsafe enough to stop. But not stable enough to relax. You climbed carefully. Deliberately. Aware that the ladder was doing its best. But not promising anything. Now here's where it failed. Balance. The ladder depended on placement. Angle. Ground. Support. If any of those were slightly wrong, the entire structure became uncertain. And yet, people climbed anyway. Because the alternative was staying where you were. And that was not always an option. So we improved ladders. Stronger materials. Better design. More stability. But even now, they wobble. They slip. They require attention. And every time you climb one, there's a small moment where you consider the risk. Just briefly. Then you continue. The medieval cart was not smooth. It was not fast. It was not designed with comfort in mind. For the driver. Or the cargo. Or the road. Which often felt like an afterthought. It was a wooden box. On wheels. Being pulled through terrain. That did not want to be traveled. The wheels were solid. No cushioning. No flexibility. Just wood. Meeting ground. With absolute honesty. Every bump was transmitted directly. Every stone acknowledged. Every uneven patch of road translated into movement. That could only be described as aggressive. Sitting in a cart was not a journey. It was an experience. You didn't ride. You endured. Now here's where the cart failed in a consistent way. It didn't protect what it carried. Goods shifted. Tilted. Occasionally escaped. Fragile items became less fragile. And more broken. And the person guiding it had very little control. You could steer. In theory. But in practice. The cart made suggestions. And the road made decisions. And yet. People used them. Because movement mattered. Trade. Travel. Transport. All depended on this system. So humanity kept the cart. Improved the wheels. Added suspension, eventually. Refined balance. But even now. Vehicles still shake. Still jolt. Still remind you. That movement is never perfectly smooth. The cart simply did it. Honestly. The medieval grindstone. The medieval grindstone was not gentle. It did not refine things delicately. It reshaped them. Through persistence. And friction. It was a large rotating stone. Turned by hand. Or foot. Or occasionally water. Depending on how ambitious the setup was. Its purpose was simple. Sharpen tools. Restore edges. Extend usefulness. And it worked. But slowly. Very slowly. Using a grindstone required patience. You held the blade. Against the surface. At the correct angle. For a long period of time. Too much pressure. And you damaged the edge. Too little. And nothing happened. Which meant you existed. In a narrow space. Between progress and mistake. Now here's where it failed. Consistency. Keeping the same angle. The same pressure. The same rhythm. Was difficult. And any small deviation. Affected the result. Blades became uneven. Edges imperfect. Sharpening was not precise. It was approximate. And yet, people relied on it. Because dull tools were worse. A dull blade required more force, more effort, more risk. So even an imperfect sharp edge was better than none. We improved the grindstone. Better materials. More control. Faster systems. But even now, sharpening tools is still about balance. Still about patience. Still about not making things worse, while trying to make them better. The medieval tongs. The medieval tongs were not graceful. They were not ergonomic. They were not designed for ease. They were designed to keep your hands slightly further away from something dangerous. Usually heat, fire, metal, objects that did not want to be touched directly. Tongs were simple. Two pieces of metal, joined at one end, moving together, with pressure. And that pressure was unreliable. Sometimes too weak. Failing to grip properly. Sometimes too strong. Making control difficult. Holding something with tongs was not secure. It was hopeful. You picked something up and trusted that it would stay there long enough to complete the task. It often didn't. Objects slipped, shifted, fell. Usually at the exact moment you were least prepared. Now here's where the tongs failed. Precision. They extended your reach, but reduced your control, which meant you were safer, but less effective. And that trade-off was unavoidable. And yet, people used them. Because distance mattered. Even a small distance. From heat. From danger. From consequence. Was enough. So we refined them. Improved grip. Better alignment. More control. But even now, tongs slip. They lose hold. They remind you that you are still interacting with something that does not want to be controlled. The medieval rope. The medieval rope was not reliable. Not completely. It was made from natural fibers, twisted together to create strength. And it worked. Until it didn't. Rope was used for everything. Lifting. Tying. Securing. Supporting weight. Sometimes more weight than it should have been trusted with. At first, it held firm, dependable. But over time, it changed. Fibers wore down. Moisture weakened them. Friction damaged them. And the rope, quietly, became less trustworthy. Now here's the problem. You couldn't always see the failure. It looked fine. Felt fine. Until the moment it wasn't. And that moment was sudden. Rope snapped. Without warning. Without negotiation. 1 second it held everything together. The next, it didn't. And yet, people used it. Because connection mattered. Holding things in place. Lifting things up. Binding things together. Required something like rope. So humanity improved it. Better materials. Stronger fibers. More durability. But even now, ropes fray. They weaken. They fail. Eventually. And we still test them. Just a little. Before trusting them fully. The medieval wheelbarrow. The medieval wheelbarrow was not balanced. Not naturally. It was a single wheel. Supporting weight. with two handles. Depending entirely on the person holding it, which meant balance was your responsibility, not the tools. You lifted the handles, adjusted your grip, and moved forward carefully. Because if the weight shifted, even slightly, the entire system reacted. The wheelbarrow did not correct itself. It followed the imbalance. And you followed it, trying to regain control, before it became a situation. Now here's where it failed. Distribution. Weight was not always even. Loads moved, settled unpredictably, which meant every step required adjustment, small corrections, constant awareness. And yet, people used it. Because carrying things by hand was worse. The wheelbarrow reduced effort. Just enough to justify its difficulty. So we improved it. Better wheels. Stronger frames. More stability. But even now, wheelbarrows tip. They lean. They remind you that balance is never guaranteed. The medieval measuring tools. The medieval measuring tools were not exact. They were not standardized. They were not consistent across places, or people, or even moments. Measurement was approximate. Length was based on body parts. A foot. A hand. An arm's reach. Which meant measurements changed depending on who was measuring. Weight was similar. Scales existed. But they required trust. And trust was flexible. Slight adjustments. Small differences, intentional or not, created outcomes that were close enough. Now here's where it failed completely. Agreement. Two people could measure the same thing and arrive at different results. Both convinced they were correct. Which made trade, construction, planning more complicated than necessary. And yet, people relied on it. Because having some measurement was better than none. So humanity standardized. Created units. Defined values. Built systems that aimed for precision. But even now, measurement is not perfect. Errors happen. Tools vary. And sometimes, things are still slightly off. Just enough to matter. The medieval fire starter was not convenient. It was not quick. It was not something you used casually. Without intention. Without patience. Without a certain level of quiet determination. Fire was not a button. It was a process. Usually, it began with flint and steel. Two objects struck together. Again. And again. And again. Producing sparks that were small, brief, and not particularly interested in becoming anything more. You aimed those sparks toward tinder. Dry material. Carefully prepared. Because if it wasn't, nothing happened. And even when it was, success was not immediate. You struck. You waited. You adjusted. You tried again. Now here's where it failed. Consistency. Sometimes everything was correct. The angle. The pressure. The material. And still, no fire. Just sparks. Disappearing into nothing. Other times, it worked. Suddenly. Unexpectedly. A small glow. A fragile beginning. That required immediate attention. You leaned in. Blew gently. Fed it carefully. Because if you didn't, it vanished. Fire was not stable. It demanded care, focus, and a willingness to start over multiple times. And yet, people relied on it. Because fire was everything. Warmth, light, cooking, survival. So even a flawed method was essential. We improved it. Matches, lighters, systems that create fire instantly. But even now, fire still requires respect. It still goes out. Still refuses sometimes. And in those moments, you feel just a small part of what it used to be. The medieval door. The medieval door was not precise. It did not fit perfectly. It did not close cleanly. It was a barrier. A piece of wood placed between you and everything outside. And that was considered enough. Doors were heavy, uneven. Hinges creaked. Not as a warning, but as a constant condition. Opening a door was not silent. It announced itself. Closing one required effort. Sometimes force. Because alignment was not guaranteed. Now here's where it failed. Sealing. Doors did not keep everything out. Wind, cold, dust, sound, all found their way through. Gaps existed. Edges didn't meet perfectly. Which meant a door was not a complete separation. It was a suggestion. And yet, people trusted it. Because the idea of a boundary mattered. Even if the reality was incomplete. Locks could be added. But as we know, those were optimistic. So the door became psychological. A signal. This is inside. That is outside. Even if the difference was not absolute. We improved doors. Better frames. Better hinges. Better seals. But even now, doors stick. They jam. They let things through. And sometimes, they don't close properly. Leaving just enough space for uncertainty. The medieval quill. The medieval quill was not smooth. It did not flow effortlessly. It did not respond perfectly to intention. It was a feather. Reshaped. To carry ink. And writing. Was negotiation. You dipped the quill into ink. Not too much. Not too little. Because either mistake created problems. Too much. And the ink pooled. Blotted. Spread beyond control. Too little. And the line faded. Broke. Disappeared mid-thought. Now here's where it failed. Consistency. The quill changed as you used it. The tip wore down. The edge softened. Lines became less precise. Which meant writing was not stable. Every sentence slightly different. Every word influenced by the state of the tool. And then there was the interruption. You had to stop. Dip again. Reset. Break the flow of thought. Writing was not continuous. It was fragmented. And yet, people wrote. Because recording ideas mattered. Even imperfectly. So we improved writing tools. Pens. Ink systems. Smooth, consistent flow. But even now, pens run out. They skip. They leak. And sometimes, a line breaks. Right when you needed it most. The medieval clock. The medieval clock was not precise. Not in the way we understand precision. Time was not something you measured exactly. It was something you observed. Early clocks existed. But they were inconsistent. Driven by mechanisms that drifted. Slightly off. Then more off. Then noticeably different from reality. Sundials were used. But only when the sun agreed. Clouds. Weather. Shadows shifting. All influenced the reading. Time was flexible. Approximate. Now here's where it failed. Agreement. 2 clocks could show different times. Both functioning. Both incorrect. In their own ways. Which meant coordination was difficult. Meetings were not exact. Schedules were suggestions. And yet, people lived within it. Because time still moved. Whether you measured it or not. So humanity refined it. Better mechanisms. More accuracy. Synchronization. But even now, clocks drift. Devices need adjustment. And time still feels different. Depending on where you are. And what you're doing. The medieval bed. The medieval bed was not comfortable. Not consistently. It was not designed for rest. In the way we expect. It was a structure. Raised slightly from the ground. With materials that did their best. Mattresses were filled with straw. Or feathers. Or whatever was available. And over time, those materials shifted. Compressed. Uneven. Creating surfaces that were unpredictable. You didn't lie down into comfort. You adjusted. Until it felt acceptable. Now here's where it failed. Support. The bed did not adapt to you. You adapted to it. Positions changed. Sleep interrupted. Small discomforts became part of the experience. And then there was everything else. Temperature. Insects. Noise. The bed did not protect you from these things. It simply lifted you slightly above them. And yet, people used it. Because sleeping on the ground was worse. So even an imperfect bed was an improvement. We refined it. Better materials. Better structure. Designed for comfort. But even now, beds fail. They creak. They sag. They become uncomfortable. Over time. And sometimes, you still wake up. Slightly off. For no clear reason. The medieval candle. The medieval candle was not reliable. It was not steady. It was not long-lasting. It was light. That slowly disappeared. Candles were made from wax. Or tallow. And they burned. Unevenly. Flames flickered. Shifted with air. Sometimes growing. Sometimes shrinking. Always uncertain. Now here's where it failed. Duration. You could not depend on a candle to last as long as you needed. It shortened. Constantly. Time and light consumed together. And then there was the mess. Wax dripped. Hardened. Collected in places it wasn't meant to be. Light came with residue. And yet, people relied on it. Because darkness was worse. So even unstable light was enough. We improved it. Electric light. Consistent. Reliable. But even now, power fails. Lights go out. And for a moment, you are left with something much closer to what they had. The medieval key was not subtle. It was not small. It was not something you carried quietly, without noticing its presence. It was large, cold, and slightly inconvenient. Keys were made of metal, often heavy, with shapes that looked complex, but behaved inconsistently. Each key was supposed to match a lock. That was the idea. But the execution was less certain. You inserted the key, felt resistance, adjusted slightly, and hoped. Sometimes it turned smoothly. Most times, it required encouragement. A slight push. A careful angle. A moment of patience. While the mechanism decided whether it agreed with you. Now here's where it failed. Precision. Keys wore down over time. Edges softened. Shapes changed. Just enough to create doubt. And that doubt meant hesitation. Would it work this time? Would it stick? Would it refuse entirely? Unlocking something was not guaranteed. And locking it felt just as uncertain. And yet, people trusted keys. Because having control over access mattered. Even if that control was imperfect. We refined keys. Smaller. More precise. More reliable. But even now, keys fail. They bend. They jam. They get lost. And sometimes, you stand at a door, turning the key, just slightly differently, hoping this time it works. The medieval mirror. The medieval mirror was not clear. It did not reflect perfectly. It did not show you exactly who you were. It showed you an interpretation. Mirrors were made from polished metal or early glass, backed imperfectly. Surfaces were uneven. Reflections distorted. Edges blurred. Looking into one was not confirmation. It was suggestion. You saw yourself. But not precisely. Features shifted slightly. Light changed everything. You adjusted your position. Trying to understand what was real and what was reflection. Now here's where it failed. Accuracy. You could not rely on it completely. Which meant your understanding of yourself was always a little uncertain. And yet, people used mirrors because even an imperfect reflection was better than none. It allowed awareness, adjustment, a sense of identity, even if it wasn't exact. We improved mirrors. Clear glass. Perfect reflection. But even now, mirrors depend on light, on angle, on perception. And sometimes, what you see still feels slightly off. The medieval nail. The medieval nail was not uniform. It was not identical to the next one. It was not predictable. Each nail was made by hand, which meant each one was slightly different. Shape varied. Size changed. Points were not always centered. Edges were not always straight. Driving a nail was not repetitive. It was individual. Each time, a new experience. You placed it, held it steady, struck it with a hammer, and watched what happened. Sometimes it went in cleanly. Sometimes it bent. Sometimes it split the wood. Now here's where it failed. Consistency. There was no guarantee that the next nail would behave like the last one. Which meant construction required attention at every step. Nothing could be assumed. And yet, people used nails because holding things together mattered, even imperfectly. So we standardized them. Mass production, uniform size, reliable shape. But even now, nails bend. They resist. They fail. In small ways. And every now and then, one goes in wrong. For no clear reason. The medieval bell. The medieval bell was not precise. It did not ring with perfect clarity. It did not produce identical sound each time. It was metal, shaped to resonate when struck. And it did. But unpredictably. The sound varied. Slight differences in force, position, timing, created different tones. Some clear. Some dull. Some not quite what you expected. Now here's where it failed. Control. You could ring a bell. But you could not fully control how it responded. And yet, bells were important. They marked time, signaled events, called attention. Even if the sound was not perfect, people listened anyway. Interpreted meaning through variation. We refined bells. Better casting. More consistent sound. But even now, sound changes. Echo. Environment. Distance. All affect what you hear. And no two rings are ever exactly the same. The medieval book. The medieval book was not easy. It was not quick to use. It was not accessible in the way we expect. It was a collection of pages, carefully created, slowly assembled, and treated with respect. Because each one took time. Writing, copying, binding. Nothing about it was fast. Pages were thick. Ink sometimes uneven. Text dense. Reading required focus, effort. And turning a page was not casual. You handled it carefully. Because damage was not easily repaired. Now here's where it failed. Availability. Books were rare. Knowledge was limited by access, which meant information moved slowly. Understanding spread unevenly. And yet, people valued them. Because even limited knowledge was powerful. So we improved books. Printing. Mass production. Accessibility. But even now, reading takes time. Focus. Attention. And sometimes, a page still feels heavier than expected. The medieval window. The medieval window was not clear. It did not provide a perfect view. It did not fully separate inside from outside. It was an opening. Sometimes covered. Sometimes not. Glass existed. But it was uneven. Distorted. Light passed through. But not cleanly. Views were blurred. Shapes shifted. Looking outside was not seeing clearly. It was interpreting. Now here's where it failed. Protection. Windows did not fully block wind, or cold, or sound. They reduced it. Slightly. Which meant the outside world was always present. Just less direct. And yet, people used them. Because light mattered. Even in perfect light. So we refined windows. Clear glass. Better insulation. But even now, windows leak. They fog. They distort. Just a little. And sometimes, you still look through one. And feel a small separation. That isn't complete. The medieval table. The medieval table was not stable. Not completely. It stood on uneven, dedicated rests. Places for things to exist. Between moments. But even now, sometimes, you still place a spoon somewhere temporary. And immediately realize that wasn't the right place. The medieval storage chest. The medieval storage chest was not organized. It did not separate things clearly. It did not categorize or optimize space. It was a box. A large, heavy, wooden box. With a lid that opened to reveal everything. Items were placed inside. Not arranged. But layered. One thing on top of another. Clothes, tools, valuables. All sharing the same space. Which meant finding something was not immediate. You opened the chest. And searched. Moved things aside. Lifted layers. Paused. To remember where you thought you placed it. Now here's where it failed. Access. Nothing was directly available. Everything required effort. Time. A small disruption. Of everything else. Just to reach one thing. And yet, people relied on it. Because having a place to store things mattered. Even if that place was chaotic. We improved storage. Shelves. Drawers. Systems of organization. But even now, chests exist. Boxes. Filled with things you don't fully remember. And when you open them, you still search. Layer by layer. Just like before. The medieval broom. The medieval broom was not efficient. It did not collect everything. It did not leave a surface perfectly clean. It was a bundle of sticks tied together, doing its best. Sweeping was not removal. It was relocation. You moved dust from one place to another. Carefully. Repeatedly. Until it gathered somewhere more acceptable. Now here's where it failed. Completion. No matter how much you swept, something remained. Fine particles. Small traces. Things that resisted movement. Which meant cleanliness was never complete. Just improved. And yet, people used brooms. Because visible order mattered. Even if invisible disorder remained. We refined brooms. Better materials. Better reach. More efficiency. But even now, dust comes back. It settles again. And cleaning is never truly finished. Only paused. The medieval basin. The medieval basin was not self-contained. It did not manage water. Beyond holding it. Temporarily. It was a simple container. Used for washing hands, face, objects. With water. That did not move. which meant the water changed quickly. Clean at first. Then less clean. Then something else entirely. And yet you continued. Because replacing the water required effort. So the basin became a compromise between clean and practical. Now here's where it failed. Renewal. It did not refresh itself. It relied on you to decide when enough was enough. And that decision was flexible. Sometimes earlier. Sometimes later. And yet people used it. Because washing mattered. Even imperfectly. We improved systems. Running water. Continuous flow. But even now, basins exist. Sinks. That hold water. That slowly becomes less clean. And we still use it. For just a little longer. Before letting it go. The medieval hook. The medieval hook was not secure. It did not lock things in place. It did not guarantee that what you hung would stay. It was a curved piece of metal attached to a surface, waiting to hold something. And it did. Most of the time. You placed an item on the hook. And it stayed. Until it didn't. A slight movement. A shift in weight. And the object slipped. Fell. Without warning. Now here's where it failed. Grip. The hook depended on balance. Not attachment. Which meant everything hung on it was temporary. And yet people used hooks. Because quick access mattered. Even if security was uncertain. We improved them. Better shapes. Stronger holds. But even now, things fall off hooks. Unexpectedly. At the exact moment. You weren't paying attention. The medieval door latch. The medieval door latch was not absolute. It did not fully secure a door. It did not eliminate movement. It was a simple mechanism. A bar. A loop. A small system. That suggested closure. You engaged it. And the door stayed. Mostly. Now here's where it failed. Pressure. A strong push. A shift in alignment. And the latch gave way. Not dramatically. Just enough. Enough to open slightly. Enough to remind you that this was not permanent. And yet, people relied on it. Because a closed door felt different than an open one. Even if the difference was minimal. We refined latches. Locks. Secure systems. But even now, latches slip. Doors open slightly. And sometimes, you hear that small movement. When everything should be still. The medieval ink bottle. The medieval ink bottle was not stable. It did not prevent spills. It did not protect its contents from movement. It was a small container holding something that wanted to escape. Ink was liquid, dark, permanent, and the bottle was often open or loosely covered, which meant any small disturbance became a problem. You reached for it carefully, moved slowly, aware that one mistake could spread across everything. Now here's where it failed. Containment. It did not forgive accidents. A small knock. A slight tilt. And the ink was everywhere. Absorbed into surfaces. Impossible to fully remove. And yet, people used it. Because writing required it. So even risk was accepted. We improved containers. Sealed bottles. Controlled flow. But even now, ink spills. Pens leak. And something permanent appears where it was never meant to be. The medieval stool. The medieval stool was not comfortable. It did not support posture. It did not adapt to the body. It was a surface, raised slightly, for sitting, usually made of wood, flat, hard, unforgiving. You sat on it, because standing, for too long, was worse. Not because it was pleasant. Now here's where it failed. Endurance. You could sit. But not for long. Discomfort built slowly. Pressure. Uneven support. A constant reminder. That this was temporary. And yet. People used stools. Because rest. Even imperfect rest. Mattered. We improved seating. Chairs. Cushions. Ergonomic design. But even now. Some seats. Are still uncomfortable. And you shift slightly. Trying to find a position. That works. Just a little better. The medieval water jug was not precise. It did not pour cleanly. It did not control flow. In a way that felt reliable. It was a container with a spout. That suggested direction. But did not guarantee it. You lifted the jug. Tilted it carefully. And watched the water respond. Sometimes it flowed smoothly. A steady stream. Predictable. Controlled. Other times. It hesitated. A pause. Then suddenly. Too much. Spilling faster than expected. Overflowing the edge of the cup. Or missing it entirely. Now here's where it failed. Control. The transition between nothing and everything was unclear. Which meant pouring. Required attention. Small adjustments. Constant awareness. And even then. Mistakes happened. Water spilled. Surfaces became wet. Hands adjusted too late. And yet. People used it. Because moving water. Mattered. Even imperfectly. We refined jugs. Better spouts. Better balance. But even now. Liquid still surprises you. Still pours differently. Than you expected. And sometimes. Just a little. Ends up where it shouldn't. The medieval shoe. The medieval shoe was not comfortable. It was not shaped perfectly. To the foot. It was. Leather. Stitched together. To protect. Just enough. Shoes varied widely. Some too tight. Some too loose. Few. Exactly right. Walking in them. Was not effortless. You adjusted your step. Shifted your weight. Accepted small discomforts. As part of movement. Now here's where it failed. Durability. Leather wore down. Stitching loosened. Water seeped through. Which meant protection. Was temporary. And yet. People wore them. Because walking barefoot. Was worse. So even imperfect shoes. Were essential. We improved them. Better materials. Better fit. But even now. Shoes wear out. They become uncomfortable. And sometimes, you feel something slightly off. With every step. The medieval glove. The medieval glove was not precise. It did not fit exactly. It did not allow full control of the hand. It was a covering, a layer between you and everything else. Gloves were made from leather or cloth, and they changed how your hand interacted with objects. Grip became uncertain. Touch became reduced. You held things, but not directly. Now here's where it failed. Feedback. You could no longer feel everything, which meant control was slightly diminished. Objects slipped more easily. Movements became less exact. And yet, people used gloves because protection mattered. Even if it reduced precision. We refined them. Better fit. Better flexibility. But even now, gloves limit you. They protect. But they also separate. And sometimes, you take them off just to feel something properly again. The medieval belt. The medieval belt was not exact. It did not adjust perfectly. It did not fit every moment with consistency. It was a strip of leather with holes placed at intervals that assumed your body would cooperate. You fastened it, choosing the closest hole, not the perfect one, just the nearest option. Now here's where it failed. Precision. There was always a slight difference. Too tight. Or too loose. Rarely exactly right. And yet, people used belts because holding things in place mattered. Even if the fit was imperfect. We improved them. Better adjustment systems. More flexibility. But even now, belts still rely on steps. And sometimes, none of them feel quite right. The medieval basket. The medieval basket was not sealed. It did not contain everything. Completely. It was woven material. Interlaced. Creating structure. With gaps. Those gaps were part of the design. Light passed through. Air moved freely. But small things could escape. Now here's where it failed. Containment. Items shifted. Moved toward openings. Occasionally slipped through. Especially the smaller ones. Which meant carrying things required awareness. You checked occasionally. Adjusted contents. Ensured nothing had been lost. Without noticing. And yet, people used baskets. Because they were light. Flexible. Easy to carry. We improved containers. Closed surfaces. Secure edges. But even now, some things still fall through. Still disappear quietly. If you're not paying attention. The medieval needle. The medieval needle was not forgiving. It did not guide itself. It did not correct mistakes. It was a thin piece of metal. With a small opening. And a very specific purpose. You threaded it. Carefully. Because even that step required patience. Then you pushed it. Through material. Again. And again. Creating connection. Now here's where it failed. Error. If you made a mistake. It stayed. Threads tangled. Stitches uneven. Undoing it required time. Effort. And sometimes, you chose not to. Because fixing it was harder than accepting it. And yet, people used needles. Because repair mattered. Even imperfect repair. We refined them. Better design. Better materials. But even now, threading a needle still requires focus. And mistakes still happen. The medieval chain. The medieval chain was not silent. It did not move smoothly. It did not operate without announcing itself. It was metal links, connected, creating strength through repetition. Chains were strong, reliable, in holding things together. But movement was another matter. Every shift created sound, a metallic response, a reminder that something was moving, whether you wanted it to or not. Now here's where it failed. Subtlety. You could not use a chain quietly. It revealed motion. Presence. Which meant control. Came with attention. And yet, people used chains. Because strength mattered more than silence. We refined them. Smoother movement. Better design. But even now, chains still make noise. Still respond. Every time they move. The medieval cloak fastener. The medieval cloak fastener was not secure. It did not hold perfectly. It did not guarantee that everything stayed in place. It was a clasp, a pin, a simple mechanism, connecting fabric. You fastened it, and it held. Most of the time. But movement changed things. Walking, turning, shifting position. All created tension. And sometimes, that tension was enough. Now here's where it failed. Stability. The connection was temporary, which meant adjustment was constant. You checked it, repositioned it, ensured it was still there. And yet, people used it because holding clothing together mattered, even if it required attention. We improved fasteners, buttons, zippers. But even now, things come undone unexpectedly. And you notice, just a little too late. The medieval walking stick. The medieval walking stick was not perfect support. It did not carry your weight fully. It did not eliminate effort. It was assistance. A piece of wood, held in the hand, helping you move just a little easier. It steadied you, gave balance, reduced strain. But it did not replace your own effort. Now here's where it failed. Dependence. You could rely on it, but not completely. It helped, but it did not solve everything. Which meant you still walked, still carried yourself, still adjusted. And yet, people used walking sticks because even partial support was valuable. We refined them. Better design. Better grip. But even now, support tools still assist, not replace. And every step still belongs to you. The medieval window was not clear. It did not offer a perfect view. It did not fully separate inside from outside. It was small panes, or sometimes just openings, covered with material that softened the world beyond it. Light entered, but not cleanly. It diffused. Spread unevenly across the room. Creating shapes. Instead of clarity. And when you looked through it, you didn't see everything. You saw enough. Shapes. Movement. Suggestions of what was there. Now here's where it failed. Definition. The outside world was never fully visible. Which meant understanding was partial. You filled in the gaps with assumption. And yet, people used windows because some light, some connection, was better than none. We improved them. Clear glass. Larger openings. But even now, windows distort. Reflections appear. And sometimes, you're not sure if you're seeing outside or yourself. The medieval table edge. The medieval table edge was not smooth. It was not rounded. It did not consider what might happen if you moved too quickly. It was wood, cut, shaped, but not refined. Edges remained firm, unforgiving. You worked around it, learned its boundaries, adjusted your movement without thinking. Now here's where it failed. Contact. A small misjudgment. And you felt it immediately. A sharp reminder of where the surface ended. No warning. Just impact. And yet, people use tables because having a surface mattered more than how it felt. We refined edges, smoothed them, softened them. But even now, some corners still catch you, still remind you exactly where they are. The medieval candle drip. The medieval candle did not stay contained. It did not burn without consequence. It was light, created slowly, by consuming itself. And as it burned, it changed. Wax softened, shifted, moved downward, dripping, one small drop at a time, onto the holder, onto the table, onto anything below. Now here's where it failed. Containment. The light was controlled. The wax was not. Which meant every moment of illumination left something behind. A trace. A build-up. That hardened over time. And yet, people used candles because light was necessary. Even if it created residue. We improved them. Better designs. Cleaner burns. But even now, wax still drips. Still forms shapes you didn't intend. The medieval door gap. The medieval door was not sealed. It did not close completely. It did not separate spaces with precision. There was always a gap. At the bottom. At the side. Small. But noticeable. Through that gap. Things moved. Air. Light. Sound. Even when the door was closed. The connection remained. Now here's where it failed. Separation. You could not fully isolate a space. Something always passed through. A draft. A whisper of movement. A reminder. That closure was incomplete. And yet, people closed doors. Because partial separation still mattered. We refined them. Better fits. Seals. But even now, some doors still leave space. Still allow something through. The medieval key. The medieval key was not convenient. It was not small. It was not easy to carry. Without noticing. It was metal. Heavy. Shaped with intention. But not simplicity. You carried it. Because you had to. It made its presence known. In your pocket. In your hand. Always there. Now here's where it failed. Ease. Using it required steps. Positioning. Alignment. A small process. Every time. Which meant access. Was never instant. And yet. People used keys. Because security. Mattered. Even if it took effort. We refined them. Smaller designs. Simpler use. But even now. Keys still get lost. Still require searching. Still delay access. Just a little. The medieval rope. The medieval rope was not consistent. It did not behave the same way. Every time. It was. Fibers. Twisted together. Creating strength. Through combination. It could hold weight. Secure objects. But it also. Shifted. Bent. Frayed over time. Now here's where it failed. Predictability. Tension changed its behavior. Too loose. And it slipped. Too tight. And it strained. Which meant using it. Required judgment. Feeling. Adjustment. And even then. It could surprise you. And yet. People relied on rope. Because connection. Mattered. Even if it wasn't perfect. We improved materials. Stronger fibers. Better consistency. But even now. Ropes wear down. Still require attention. Still demand trust. The medieval shelf. The medieval shelf was not balanced. It did not distribute weight perfectly. It did not guarantee that everything placed on it would remain stable. It was a flat surface, attached to a wall, doing its best to hold. You placed items on it, carefully, spacing them, without measuring, guessing what felt right. Now here's where it failed. Load. Too much weight. Or uneven placement. And the shelf responded. A slight tilt. A subtle shift. A warning. Before anything worse happened. Which meant awareness. Was constant. You noticed. When something felt off. And adjusted. And yet. People used shelves. Because vertical space. Mattered. We refined them. Stronger supports. Better design. But even now. Shelves still sag. Still shift slightly. Over time. The medieval mirror. The medieval mirror was not accurate. It did not reflect perfectly. It did not show you exactly as you were. It was polished metal. Or imperfect glass. Creating an image that resembled reality. But never fully matched it. You looked into it. And saw yourself. But slightly altered. Distorted. Changed by the surface. Now here's where it failed. Truth. The reflection. Was approximate. Which meant self-perception. Was uncertain. You adjusted based on something that wasn't exact. And yet. People used mirrors. Because seeing yourself. Even imperfectly. Mattered. We refined them. Clear reflections. Accurate images. But even now. Mirrors can deceive. Angles change things. Light shifts perception. And sometimes, you don't look exactly how you expected. The medieval step. The medieval step was not uniform. It did not follow exact measurements. It did not create a consistent rhythm. Each step was slightly different. Height varied. Depth shifted. Which meant walking required attention. You couldn't rely on repetition. Each movement was its own decision. Now here's where it failed. Expectation. You assumed the next step would match the last. But sometimes, it didn't. And that small difference was enough. A stumble. A pause. A quick correction. And yet, people used steps because elevation required them. We refined them. Standard sizes. Predictable patterns. But even now, unexpected steps exist. And they still catch you just slightly off guard. The medieval curtain was not complete. It did not fully block light. It did not fully ensure privacy. It was fabric, hung with intention, but limited in effect. You pulled it across, and something changed. The light dimmed. The space softened. But it never disappeared entirely. Shadows remained. Shapes still existed. On the other side. Now here's where it failed. Separation. It suggested privacy. Without guaranteeing it. Movement behind it was still visible. Sound passed through. Almost unchanged. And yet, people used curtains. Because partial concealment still mattered. We improved them. Thicker materials. Better coverage. But even now, curtains don't fully isolate. They shift slightly. With air. They leave small gaps. At the edges. And sometimes, you still feel slightly visible. The medieval ladle. The medieval ladle was not exact. It did not measure consistently. It did not deliver equal portions. It was a deep spoon. Designed to carry. But not to calculate. You dipped it into liquid. Lifted it carefully. And poured. Each time was slightly different. More. Or less. Depending on angle. Timing. Movement. Now here's where it failed. Precision. There was no exact amount. Only approximation. Which meant sharing was uneven. Subtle differences between one portion and another. And yet, people used ladles because distribution mattered more than accuracy. We refined measurement. Standard units. Clear quantities. But even now, pouring still varies. Still depends on the moment. The medieval floor. The medieval floor was not even. It did not provide a perfectly stable surface. It was stone, wood, earth, formed over time, rather than perfected. Walking across it was not automatic. Small variations existed everywhere. A slight dip. A raised edge. Subtle shifts. That required awareness. Now here's where it failed. Consistency. You could not fully relax into movement. Each step carried a small uncertainty, which meant balance was active, not assumed. And yet, people lived on these floors because having a surface mattered, even if it wasn't perfect. We refined them. Leveled surfaces. Smooth finishes. But even now, floors still shift. Still creak. Still remind you that they're not entirely still. The medieval cup. The medieval cup was not uniform. It did not match others. It did not hold the exact same amount every time. It was handmade, shaped individually, with small differences in form. You picked one up, and it felt slightly unique. Weight varied. Edges differed. Now here's where it failed. Standardization. You couldn't rely on consistency. One cup was not the same as another, which meant expectation had to adjust each time. And yet, people used cups because holding liquid mattered more than precision. We refined them. Uniform shapes. Measured capacity. But even now, some cups still feel different. Still sit in your hand with a slight unfamiliarity. The medieval bench. The medieval bench was not personal. It did not belong to one person. It did not adjust to individual comfort. It was shared. A long surface. Meant for many. You sat where there was space. Not where it felt best. Now here's where it failed. Individuality. There was no customization. No adjustment. Which meant comfort was collective. Compromised. And yet, people used benches because gathering mattered. Even if comfort was limited. We refined seating. Individual chairs. Personal space. But even now, shared seating exists. And sometimes, you still adjust to fit within it. The medieval fire tongs. The medieval fire tongs were not precise. They did not grip perfectly. They did not allow delicate control. They were metal arms, designed to reach heat without touching it. You used them to move burning material carefully, because control was limited. Now here's where it failed. Grip. Objects slipped, shifted unexpectedly, which meant handling fire required attention and acceptance that things might not go exactly as planned. And yet, people use tongs because distance from heat mattered. We refined tools. Better grip. Better control. But even now, some tools still slip. Still require correction. Mid-action. The medieval bag. The medieval bag was not structured. It did not hold its shape. It did not organize its contents. It was soft material. Flexible. Changing form. Based on what it carried. You placed items inside. And they settled. Shifted. Found their own positions. Now here's where it failed. Order. Nothing stayed exactly where you placed it. Items moved with every step, which meant finding something required searching, feeling through layers. And yet, people used bags because carrying things mattered, even without structure. We refined them. Compartments. Defined spaces. But even now, some bags still become chaotic. Still hide things in unexpected places. The medieval spoon, again. The medieval spoon returns because some things don't resolve. The first time you use it. Again. And again. And each time the same small questions appear. Where to place it? How to keep it clean? What happens next? Now here's where it fails. Again. Resolution. There is no final solution. Only repeated decisions. Small. Unnoticed. But constant. And yet. You keep using it. Because function continues. Even without perfection. And that repetition feels familiar. The medieval silence. The medieval silence was not empty. It did not remove sound completely. It was filled with small things. Subtle movement. Distant activity. The environment. Never fully still. Now here's where it failed. Absence. There was always something. Which meant silence. Was not nothing. It was less. And yet. People experienced it. Because even reduced noise felt like quiet. And even now. Silence is never absolute. There's always something. Just beneath it. The medieval door handle was not ergonomic. It did not fit naturally in the hand. It was a shape. Meant to be used. But not optimized. You reached for it. Gripped it. And turned. Sometimes easily. Sometimes with resistance. Now here's where it failed. Consistency. Each handle felt different. Worn surfaces. Slight misalignment. Small imperfections. All changed the experience. Which meant opening a door was never exactly the same twice. And yet. People used them. Because access mattered. Even if it required adjustment. We refined handles. Better shapes. Smoother motion. But even now. Some handles still stick. Still resist. Just slightly. Before giving way. The medieval bread crumb. The medieval bread crumb was not contained. It did not stay where it was created. It was a fragment. Small. Light. Easily moved. You broke bread. And it appeared. Quietly. Then it traveled. Across the table. Onto the floor. Into spaces you didn't notice. Now here's where it failed. Control. Once created. It was difficult to manage. Too small to track. Too many to follow. Which meant presence. Spread. And yet. People accepted it. Because eating came with consequence. We refined cleanliness. Better surfaces. Better tools. But even now. Crumbs still appear. Still gather. In places you didn't expect. The medieval pitcher lip. The medieval pitcher lip was not clean. It did not release liquid perfectly. After pouring. Something remained. A small amount. Clinging. To the edge. Now here's where it failed. Completion. The pour ended. But not completely. A final drop. Formed slowly. Then fell. Not into the cup. But elsewhere. Which meant every use. Had a trace. A small. Uncontrolled ending. And yet. People used pitchers. Because pouring. Was necessary. We refined edges. Cleaner cuts. Better flow. But even now. That final drop. Still happens. The medieval wall. The medieval wall was not flat. It did not form a perfect plane. It was Constructed. Layer by layer. With variation. You looked at it. And saw stability. But up close. There were differences. Small shifts. Texture. Unevenness. Subtle depth. Now here's where it failed. Uniformity. Nothing aligned perfectly. Which meant placing something against it required adjustment. And yet, people built walls. Because separation, structure, mattered more than perfection. We refined surfaces, smoothed them, aligned them. But even now, walls still have imperfections. Still reveal their construction. If you look closely, the medieval thread end. The medieval thread end was not secure. It did not disappear neatly. After sewing, something remained. A loose end. Small. But present. Now here's where it failed. Closure. The work was finished. But not completely. That final piece needed attention. Tying. Cutting. Hiding. And if ignored, it unraveled. Slowly. And yet, people worked with thread. Because connection mattered. We refined finishing. Cleaner techniques. But even now, loose ends still exist. Still need to be dealt with. Before something is truly done. The medieval stair rail. The medieval stair rail was not continuous. It did not guide you the entire way. It was present, then absent, then present again, which meant support was inconsistent. You reached for it, and sometimes it wasn't there. Now here's where it failed. Reliability. You couldn't depend on it fully. Which meant balance. Returned to you. Without warning. And yet, people used rails. Because partial support was still helpful. We refined them. Continuous design. But even now, some supports still end before you expect them to. The medieval pot lid. The medieval pot lid was not sealed. It did not lock in place. It simply rested on top. You placed it carefully, aligned it, and hoped it stayed. Now here's where it failed. Stability. Movement. Steam. Pressure. All shifted it. A small rattle. A slight lift. A reminder that it wasn't fixed. And yet, people used lids. Because covering mattered. Even without certainty. We refined them. Tighter fits. Secure placement. But even now, lids still rattle. Still move. Just slightly. The medieval shadow. The medieval shadow was not stable. It did not stay in one place. It was dependent on light, on movement, on time. You observed it. And it changed. Shifted slowly. Or suddenly. Now here's where it failed. Consistency. It could not be relied on. Which meant perception was always adjusting. And yet, people lived with shadows. Because they were part of light. We refined lighting. More control. But even now, shadows move. Still follow. And distort. The medieval pause. The medieval pause was not intentional. It did not always happen by choice. It was a gap between actions, between moments. Sometimes noticed. Sometimes not. Now here's where it failed. Definition. You couldn't always tell when it began or ended, which meant time blurred slightly. And yet, pauses existed, because action couldn't continue endlessly. Even now, pauses remain. Small spaces where nothing happens, but something still feels present. The medieval continuation. The medieval continuation was not planned. It did not follow a clear structure. It simply kept going. One action leading to another, without a defined end. Now here's where it failed. Completion. There was always more. Another step. Another adjustment. Another small detail to notice. And yet, continuation persisted. Because stopping was not always clear. And even now, this continues. Not because it must, but because it can. The medieval table leg was not exact. It did not match the others perfectly. It was close enough. Carved. Shaped. Attached. But never identical. Which meant the table stood. But not evenly. Now here's where it failed. Balance. There was always a slight difference. A subtle shift. A point where one leg carried more weight than the others. And sometimes that difference revealed itself. A small wobble. Not constant. Just enough to remind you it was there. And yet, people used the table because standing almost evenly was enough. We refined structure, measured lengths, perfect alignment. But even now, some tables still wobble. And you adjust them slightly, without thinking. The medieval spoon edge. The medieval spoon edge was not smooth. It did not meet the mouth with perfect comfort. It was functional. Formed quickly. Used often. Now here's where it failed. Contact. A slight roughness. A small irregularity. Something you noticed, but did not stop using. Because the act continued. And yet, people accepted it. Because function was more important than refinement. We improved finishes. Smoother edges. But even now, occasionally, something feels slightly off. And you notice it. Just for a moment. The medieval grain sack. The medieval grain sack was not sealed tightly. It did not hold everything without loss. It was fabric. Filled. Tied at the top. But never completely closed. Now here's where it failed. Containment. Small grains found their way out. Through gaps. Through seams. A slow, almost invisible loss. Which meant fullness. Changed over time. Without a clear moment. When it happened. And yet, people used sacks. Because holding most of something was enough. We refined storage. Sealed containers. But even now, small losses still occur. Quietly. Over time. The medieval door sound. The medieval door sound was not predictable. It did not open silently. It did not close. Without response. Every movement created something. A creak. A shift. A low wooden tone. Now here's where it failed. Stealth. You could not move. Without being heard. The door announced you. Even when you tried to be careful. And yet, people used doors. Because separation mattered more than silence. We refined hinges. Smoother movement. But even now, some doors still speak. Still reveal that they've been touched. The medieval ash. The medieval ash was not stable. It did not stay where it settled. It was what remained. Light. Soft. Easily disturbed. Now here's where it failed. Stillness. The smallest movement shifted it. Air passing. A step nearby. And it lifted. Briefly. Before settling again. Which meant the past never fully stayed. It moved. Just slightly. Into the present. And yet. People lived with ash. Because fire left something behind. Even now. Fine remnants. Still move. Still refuse to stay completely still. The medieval handle grip. The medieval handle grip was not consistent. It did not feel the same. Each time you used it. Where changed it. Hands shaped it. Time altered its surface. Now here's where it failed. Familiarity. Something you used often. Was never exactly the same. Which meant every interaction was slightly new. And yet, people adapted. Because use reshaped things. We refined materials. Maintained surfaces. But even now, frequent use still changes objects. Still leaves marks that you can feel. The medieval air. The medieval air was not empty. It did not go unnoticed. It carried things. Smell. Warmth. Movement. Now here's where it failed. Neutrality. Air was never just air. It always contained something. Which meant every space had a presence. Something subtle. But constant. And yet, people lived within it. Because there was no alternative. Even now, air carries traces. Things you don't see. But still experience. The medieval waiting. The medieval waiting was not defined. It did not have clear boundaries. It was time passing. Without action. But not without awareness. Now here's where it failed. Clarity. You didn't always know when waiting began. Or when it ended. Which meant time felt different. Slower. Stretched. And yet, waiting existed. Because not everything happened immediately. Even now, waiting remains. In small moments. Between everything else. The medieval almost. The medieval almost was not completion. It was close. But not finished. A task nearly done. An action nearly complete. Now here's where it failed. Finality. There was always one more step. Something small. Left undone. And yet, almost, was accepted. Because reaching perfection was rare. Even now, almost exists. In things you leave. Just before the end. The medieval continuation again. And now, we arrive here. Again. Not at the end. Not at a conclusion. Just further along. Because continuation doesn't resolve. It extends. Quietly. Gradually. Without needing a clear reason. And that's where this remains. Still moving. Still noticing. Still continuing. The medieval corner was not exact. It did not form a perfect angle. It was two surfaces meeting as closely as they could, but never precisely. Now here's where it failed. Alignment. There was always a slight deviation, a small gap, or an uneven join, which meant nothing. Fit perfectly into it. Objects placed there sat slightly off. And yet, corners still existed. Because direction had to change somewhere. We refined them. Sharper lines. Exact angles. But even now, some corners still feel just slightly wrong. The medieval spill. The medieval spill was not sudden. It did not always happen. All at once. Sometimes. It began slowly. A tilt. Barely noticeable. A shift. Just enough. Now here's where it failed. Interruption. There was no clear moment when it could be stopped. By the time you noticed, it had already begun. And continuing it felt inevitable. And yet, spills happened. Because control was never complete. Even now, some mistakes don't start loudly. They begin quietly. And continue. Before you can respond. The medieval thread pull. The medieval thread pull was not contained. It did not stop. When it should. You noticed it. A small loose thread. And pulled. Gently at first. Now here's where it failed. Limitation. It didn't end. It continued. Beyond what you expected. Unraveling more than intended. Which meant fixing one thing became changing another. And yet, people pulled threads. Because leaving them felt incomplete. Even now. Some small adjustments